Marksman Rifles in Helldivers 2 are long-range weapons with high damage and a slower fire rate. Typically, they haven't been seen as overly strong, but rather as a welcome weapon type for our sniper fans, rewarding players that have good aim. And now we can modify these things to make improvements to their stats. Which begs the question, which of these Marksman Primaries are the best and which are the worst? Dr. Booplove here, and that's what I'd like to find out. In this video, I have grinded to level 25 for every Marksman Rifle in Helldivers 2 and rank them on a tier list, with S being the best and Poop Hater being the worst. But not just one tier list, 3 tier lists, because the performance of these weapons will vary wildly depending on whether you are facing off against the Terminids, the Automatons, or the Illuminate. Starting with the R63 Diligence, which is a light armor penetrating marksman rifle with a high damage and a decent fire rate. It also has some good ergonomics and a combat scope as a default, but this can change depending on how you wish to modify this. Now, whereas in my previous video on assault rifles, I like to modify these largely to reduce their recoil, in the case of marksman rifles, I more often opt to improve the ergonomics or weapon handling. This is mostly due to the slower fire rate of marksman rifles, which makes the recoil more controllable, but also ergonomic improvements can be useful to snap to targets faster, making it easier to both target enemies at range, but also make it more usable to get at those closer enemies. Now, for the Diligence, I will go for the iron sights to maximize my ergonomics, but also because I mostly play in third-person view. I put the angled foregrip for even more ergonomics, and I leave it at no attachment for the muzzle for, yes, more ergonomics. When compared to the default, this makes your handling much tighter and snappier. It was already pretty good though for the Diligence, so if you want to reduce some recoil, you certainly can as an alternative route, and that will help if you wish to spam your shots at a little bit of a faster rate. Now, when we take this out versus the bugs, you might not expect this to be that good, because marksman rifles imply precision and accuracy, and that doesn't really seem to bode too well versus a horde who wants to get close and surround you. But I do have to say, I don't think this is the worst. This thing has good damage, which punches through the bugs very well, and having that good precision means if you enjoy accurate takedowns, this will be a good option. The main downside though is in panic situations, it's much harder to be precise, and so this may have your back a little bit less. But at least improving the ergonomics can help you snap to those targets a little quicker, and of course, you can try to cover for this downside in other parts of your loadout, like having the Redeemer equipped in your secondary slot. I really like this gun, but I recognize it's not the best, so I have to give it a B versus the bugs. Now, versus the bots, this does have more advantages in that yes, it is useful at range where you will face bots more often, and it does do pretty well here. I do find it necessary to put a scope on this one in order to face off at range, and although this one is not the best for your ergonomics, I do like the combat scope, as that gives you some good range and even some options to snipe at different ranges. This does have a disadvantage though, in that it is only light armor penetrating, but at least being precise allows you to more easily get at those lower armor weak spots, and with pretty good damage you can even do things like one-shot headshot devastators, which makes this a very good precision gun. Now, while this isn't going to be good for the Hulks, it can often get them from the back, but one thing to note is that if you are on the Jet Brigade front, the Hulks have these jump packs which are medium armor penetrating, so if you do get behind them, you won't have any luck with this thing. Overall though, this does feel pretty decent for the bots, but on a front that really favors medium penetrating guns, this will unfortunately fall a bit flat. That's why for me, it gets a B for the bots. And versus the squids, this is also okay. I modify this the same way as with the bugs, with iron sights on my scope for even better ergonomics, especially as I feel you need the scope much less on this front. The damage feels great on this, and the fire rate is fast enough to do well versus the horde. The damage will take out the overseers well, feeling like they can wreck these otherwise pretty tanky guys. And it also does do well versus the watchers, and having that good ergonomics can get you on target a little quicker. For the flesh mobs, this isn't going to be anything awesome or noteworthy, but it will take them down after a few mags. And this will not be effective for stingrays or harvesters, as it is only light armor penetrating. This is though perhaps the best marksman rifle for shields, which gives it some points. For me, this is a B for the squids. But the Diligence actually has a big brother, the R63 CS Diligence Counter Sniper, which is a medium armor variant of the Diligence with more damage but a smaller capacity and much worse handling. But at least you can modify this, which I typically do, by taking off the sniper scope, which really does worsen your ergonomics, and trading it in for really any of the other options that you prefer. I also have the angled foregrip and no muzzle attachment for max ergonomics. After all this, it still doesn't have the best ergonomics, but it is now a little bit better. Now for the bugs, I actually think this is worse than the Diligence, because although you do have medium armor penetration, and that can help with things like hive guards and bile spewers, the mag size is really too small, and the handling is still a bit weaker even with the mods. This also is just not very good at handling close range combat, which presents itself far more often than you would like on this front. When you do have some distance, you can snipe well with this, but that's just going to be a lot less useful on this front, and I would still prefer the base Diligence or even something like the Eruptor if long range play is what you're aiming for. So I'm going to give this a C for the bugs. Now, unlike versus the bugs, the Diligence Counter Sniper is actually amazing versus the bots. I modify this the same, but I make sure to have the combat scope on, which does give me better visibility at range and also better ergonomics than the sniper scope. The impactful medium armor penetrating shots go a long way on this front, allowing you to take on pretty much every enemy and doing so with precision and packing a punch. This also can fire pretty fast, so when you do get in a jam and some enemies are too close, this can give you some versatility. And one cool thing is that if you are on the Jet Brigade front, this can actually get the Hulks from the front if you aim for the top of their medium armor jump packs, giving you a nice advantage and rewarding you for having good accuracy and just not making you have to go around the back. If anything, I just wish that this had a little bit more damage to deal out versus some of the bigger enemies like the gunships and the tank vents, where you do have a lot of explosive weapons outshining this. And for that, it's hard to give it an S, but it's almost there. I really like this. I will give it an A for the bots. And versus the squids, this can be pretty good as well. Now, it won't be the best for the Voteless Horde, as there is that smaller capacity and is just going to be less of a horde clearing weapon, but the high damage still will take them out pretty quickly. This won't really stand out as a good flesh mob pick, as those guys are very tanky, but not much will. Where this does start to shine is versus the Overseers, being able to dish out good body damage, but also get them in the head. Watchers are easy to take out with this, and because this is medium armor penetrating, it can take down a Stingray and pretty decently due to its higher fire rate. It even does do pretty well versus the Harvesters, being able to take off their shield generator, and kill them from the leg joints fairly nicely. I think this would be a little bit higher if it had better ergonomics, as even the mods don't seem to make it good enough. And so you might want something like the Peak Physique perk in order to help you there. Overall, this is solid. I will give it a low A for the squids. But let's head on down to the wild, wild west for this next one. We have the R6 Deadeye. Yeehaw! And this is a lever action marksman rifle with medium armor penetration, a good bit of damage and stagger, as well as rounds reload. And this actually does do the most damage out of all the marksman rifles. Unfortunately, as far as modifications go though, there's not much here. You're only going to be able to modify the scopes, and that's only going to impact your ergonomics and how you see things in first person view. Iron sights tends to be my preferred option here, at least versus the bugs, due to having the best ergonomics, and because I mostly play in third person. But a lot of this is just going to come down to preference and whether you want to trade some ergonomics for perhaps a worse first person aiming experience. Now for the bugs, well, despite having some good stats, this is still not the best. While the damage is high, the fire rate is slow and the capacity is low, which can make for a tough combination on this front. This does dish out some decent stagger with that high damage though, which at least can help you hold back some of the more aggressive enemies like the Predator Stalkers, although the low capacity means that you need to make sure every shot counts. With the medium armor penetration here, it means it will be good for hive guards and bile spewers. The handling on this is actually decent, but since you don't have mods to help improve it further, you may want to have something like the Peak Physique perk to help there. Overall, it's a bit of a struggle taking this out versus the bugs, but with the stagger being very valuable on this front and with some high damage, I can see this having some impact. I will give it a low B for the bugs. Now for the bots, this is quite a bit better. I like to put a scope on here to help at range, and I find this doing quite well. The accuracy, the damage, and the medium armor penetration means this will do well versus most things on this front, one-shotting Devastators in the heads and taking out Striders fast. It even has some good stagger to it, which is great, especially when those jump-packing Devastators get up in your face. I do wish this was heavy armor penetrating to deal with the Hulks, but at least you can use it versus the Jet Brigade Hulks to hit them from the front, aiming for the top of their jump pack. I like this, but I don't know that it is better than the Jar Dominator, which is pretty close to, so I don't think this is at the top. I will give it an A for the bots. And for the squids, this has some pros and cons. The best aspect of this is its ability to take overseers out with a single headshot. While not amazing for the Voteless Horde, this does one-shot them and do collateral as well. This takes out the Watchers quickly, and it's actually not that bad for the Harvesters, although the slower fire rate and lower capacity can make it a little difficult. Despite having a lot of damage, this doesn't feel like it does significantly better with the Flesh Mob, but having medium armor penetration means that it can deal with the Stingray, although it fires a bit too slow to get them in one swoop. Its slow fire rate can also make it a bit rough to use on the shields. I do like this, especially for the Overseer's heads, and that can be really rewarding, especially if you have good accuracy, but I just think that one thing is not enough to give this super high marks. I will give it a B for the squids. But now let's travel back in time to check out a relic of the First Galactic War, the R-2124 Constitution, which is a slow-firing antique marksman rifle with decently high damage, medium armor penetration, and a very slow fire rate. It does kind of feel a little bit similar to the Deadeye, but quite a bit worse. One thing this does have, though, is a bayonet, allowing for increased melee damage when in use. Now, unfortunately, this cannot be modified in any way that actually affects any gameplay, and that's pretty poop. So you might actually be asking, why did I actually bother leveling this thing all the way to 25? Well, mostly I just did it for the memes, but also for the Venus skin, because you can modify its look. Now, versus the bugs, this struggles quite a bit, unfortunately. While the high damage and armor penetration can hit the bugs hard, the slow fire rate and limited mag size makes it difficult to feel like you are making any significant impact on the Horde. And while you can get some good melee out of this, including getting some increased melee damage by using the Peak Physique perk or the reinforced epaulets, this really won't be able to defend you for too long. What was clearly an S tier gun long ago is really only here for the memes, and so we gotta give this a poop tier. Now, although you might expect the same score for the bots, I will say there is a slight increase in viability here. The medium armor penetration actually makes this much more serviceable versus most enemies, and it can even take the Devastators out in a single headshot, as well as being able to get the Jet Brigade Hulks from the front. The bayonet requires you to close the distance too much, so it's not really going to be that useful. Although this is kind of a meme gun, this can actually perform okay on this front, but ultimately it still just suffers from a lot of the same problems, and really it doesn't make sense to take this when the Deadeye exists. So I'll give it a C for the bots. Now for the squids, this is just straight poop. The slow fire rate means you won't be mowing down the Voteless Horde very well at all, although I guess you can get some decent use with the bayonet. Versus the Overseers and the Watchers, it seems to take a good number of bullets to take them down, and is even slower with that slower fire rate, of course. For Flesh Mobs, this is really bad and slow, and trust me, don't try to use the bayonet on this. For Stingrays, sure, this can damage it, but you will be lucky to get more than 2 shots in with a single swoop. Sure, it's capable of taking down a Harvester, but at what cost? This thing can't even take down the shields in a full mag. And generally, you're just playing with your hands tied behind your back. Don't use this. This is poop hater tier, no doubt. But even though the Constitution is far from perfect, we do have the option to change that with the next gun, the R2 Amendment. Now, despite the name implying that this may be some sort of a Constitution variant, aside from having a bayonet as well, this is not really similar. And actually, I find this to be more comparable to the Diligence. It has light armor penetration and a decent amount of damage, as well as the ability to burst fire this thing or just stick with semi-auto. As far as the mods go, you're only able to modify the scopes. And I do find that to be kind of weird, as this was one of the first guns to come out after mods were introduced. Regardless, I usually take this off the combat scope for one of the others, which will give you better ergonomics. Now, versus the bugs, it's actually not too bad. The fast fire rate, higher damage, and decent ergonomics makes this take things out pretty well. And it actually does a bit more damage than the Diligence, which makes the shots feel stronger. The burst fire pattern I feel is kind of cool, as it makes each trigger pull dish out a ton of damage, but to be honest, you can match that speed on your own. Putting it on semi will just give you more variability, allowing you to shoot as fast or as slow as you want, or put as many bullets in as you want. What's nice is when enemies get closer to you, you can switch from firing at them to your bayonet to get some good melee damage. And this pairs well with the peak physique perk, giving you better ergonomics and melee damage, or even to a lesser extent, the reinforced epaulets, which will help that melee damage a little bit. This does ultimately struggle a bit versus the more aggressive enemies, but the high damage and a decently high capacity, plus the ability to melee, makes this not too bad of an option. I'm going to give this a low A for the bugs. Now, for the bots, this is not as impressive. The bayonet is not nearly as useful, as you have to get very close, and while the higher damage is there, you have light armor penetration, which makes you have to aim for weak spots. In this case, I would much prefer the Diligence, which, while it does have a little bit less damage, it does have a higher capacity and more modification options. And so I'm going to give this a C for the bots. Now, for the squids, this is decent. The fast fire rate can help versus the horde, as well as the bayonet, which can save you some ammo. It's not going to be awesome for the flesh mobs, of course, but it can dish out some good damage to the overseers, which is nice. This also is pretty good for the shields, but since it's only light armor penetrating, it's not going to be usable versus the stingrays or the harvesters. For all that, I'm going to give this a B for the squids. And so here we have our lists. This is how the Marksman Rifles fare versus the Terminids. Here is how they rank versus the automatons, and here is where they are for the Illuminate. Unfortunately, I didn't really find any of these to be S tier, so hopefully Arrowhead will add some special Marksman Rifles to this category in the future. But these are just only some of the primary weapons that we will need to level up and re-rank. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out as I continue my journey ranking these guns up, but in the meantime, you should check out how the assault rifles ranked right here. Special shout out to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement, but otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.